If a task used to take 3 hours and now takes 15 minutes, what happens to the process that turns beginners into experts? What happens after years of using these tools? How will the next generation become experts? Lately, when people talk about AI, the conversation usually goes in one of two directions. Either people are excited about everything AI can do, or they are worried about the jobs it might replace. Strangely, it doesn't get discussed very often. Because if you think about it, every expert was once a beginner. Every experienced professional, business owner, manager, person who became exceptionally good at something, at some point, they were just trying to figure things out. They didn't just start with years of experience out of nowhere. They built it little by little over time, and that's what got me thinking. If AI starts taking over more of the work that beginners traditionally did, what happens next? Not what happens to the jobs itself. We've already had that conversation 1,000 times. What I'm thinking about is something different. What happens to the process of becoming experienced? What happens to the path that turns the beginner into an expert? For decades, that path was relatively clear. You started at the bottom, you learned, made mistakes, then improved, and eventually you became the person teaching someone else. But today, some of those first steps are beginning to change. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's one of the most interesting questions in AI right now. I think most of us underestimate how expertise is actually built. When we look at somebody who's been doing something for 20 years, it's easier to assume that what makes them valuable is what they know. And of course, knowledge matters. But knowledge is only part of the story. A lot of what we call expertise comes from experience. It comes from seeing situations play out over and over again. From making mistakes, solving issues, realizing that something you thought would work doesn't. And the interesting thing is that most of those lessons aren't particularly memorable when they are happening. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, "Today, I become an expert." It doesn't work like that. Most careers are built gradually. You learn something, then you learn another thing, and then one day you find yourself dealing with situations that used to confuse you, and now they seem obvious. Not because somebody explained them to you, but because you've seen them before. If you ever work with someone who's been in an industry for a long time, you've probably noticed this. Sometimes they can look at a problem for 30 seconds and immediately spot something that everyone else missed. And from the outside, it looks like intuition, but most of the time, it's not intuition. It's a pattern recognition. It's experience. It's years of seeing similar situations and slowly building a mental library of what works and what doesn't. And that's why the beginnings of a career has always been so important. Not because beginners are doing the most important work. Usually they are not. The beginning matters because that's where the learning happens. That's where the people start building their foundation that eventually becomes expertise. And for a long time, that process was fairly predictable. You started with simple responsibilities, you gained experience, and over time, you earned the opportunity to take on bigger decisions. Which brings us to the next question that I think is becoming increasingly important. What happens when some of those early experiences start to change? The interesting thing is that this isn't the first time technology has changed the way people work. We've seen that happen over and over again. Computers change offices. The internet changed access to information. Smartphones changed how we communicate. None of that is new. What makes AI interesting is where it's starting to show up. Because for a long time, technology mostly helped people do their jobs. AI is starting to help people think through their jobs. And that's a very different thing. A few years ago, if you were given a complicated report to review, you had to sit down and work through yourself. Maybe it took 2 hours, maybe it took 5, and it could probably take the entire afternoon. Today, a lot of people will upload it into AI tool and get the main point back in a matter of seconds. And honestly, that's amazing, right? I'll do it. Millions of people actually do it. Businesses do it. There's a reason these tools are spreading so quickly. They are useful, but when you look a little deeper, something interesting starts to happen because part of what made people better at their jobs What's the process itself? Not just the final answer. Sometimes you learn something because you spend 3 hours trying to understand it. Sometimes you notice a pattern because you've seen the same problem 20 times before. Sometimes the experience came from the struggle. And that's what makes me wonder where all of this is heading. Because if more of the work gets compressed, if tasks that used to take hours now take minutes, then the question isn't just what happens to productivity. We've talked about productivity before. The bigger question is what happens to experience, right? What happens to learning? What happens to the process that turns beginners into experts? Because that's not something we usually think about when we talk about AI. What makes this conversation difficult is that nobody really knows what happens next. And I think that's important to acknowledge. Whenever a new technology appears, people usually rush to make predictions. Some people say everything is going to change. Other people say nothing is going to change. And the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. When I look at AI, I don't see a future where humans suddenly become unnecessary. I don't think that's realistic, but I do think we're going to see a different path to becoming a good at something. For example, imagine somebody starting their career today. They are going to have to access to tools that didn't exist a few years ago. They can get answers faster. They can analyze information faster. They can even produce work faster. In many ways, that's a huge advantage. Honestly, if I were starting my career today, I'll be using these tools every single day. But at the same time, I find myself wondering something. If a task used to take 3 hours and now takes 15 minutes, what changes beside the time? Do they develop the same instincts? Do they notice the same patterns? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows yet, because sometimes the value of doing something isn't the output. It's what happens in your head while you're doing it. Think about anything you've become good at it in life. Businesses, sports, writing, learning a language. Almost nobody becomes good because they were given all the answers from the beginning. Usually they become good because they spend years figuring things out, making mistakes, getting things wrong, slowly building confidence. And that's why I think this topic is so interesting. Not because AI is replacing that process completely, but because it might be changing it. And we're still too early to understand what those changes will look like 10 or 20 years from now. If there's one thing I keep coming back to, is this. The people entering the workforce over the next few years are going to have very different experience than the generation before them. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just different. And honestly, that's probably true of every major technological shift. The people who entered the workforce when the internet became mainstream had a different experience. The same thing happened with smartphones. And now we're watching it happen again with AI. The difference is that AI is arriving much faster than most technologies we've seen before. And a lot of these tools have gone from experimental to everyday use in a surprisingly short period of time, which means people are having to adapt while the rules are still being written. And that's not always easy. If I were starting my career today, I don't think I'll be asking how to avoid AI. That ship has probably sailed. I'll be asking a different question. How do I use these tools without becoming dependent on them? Because there's a difference between using a calculator and forgetting how to do math. As well, between using a GPS and completely losing your sense of direction. And I think something similar might happen with AI. The goal isn't to ignore technology. The goal is to make sure you're still developing your own judgment at the same time. Because at the end of the day, tools come and go. Technology changes. Industries evolve, but the ability to think critically, to solve problems, to make decisions when the answer isn't obvious, those skills tend to remain valuable no matter what technology happens to be available. And maybe that's the real challenge. Not learning how to compete against AI, learning how to grow alongside it. The more I think about this topic, the more I realize that we're probably asking the wrong questions. A lot of the discussions around AI focuses on what the technology can do today. Can it write, code, analyze data, automate tasks? These questions do matter, but they are relatively short-term questions. The more interesting question is what happens after years of using these tools? What happens after an entire generation grows up with AI as part of their everyday life? Because we're still early in the story. Most of these tools have only been widely available for a few years. We haven't seen what 10 years look like. We definitely haven't seen what 20 years looks like. Maybe future professionals become more capable than ever. Maybe they learn faster. They solve bigger problems because they spend less time on repetitive work. I hope that's what happens. Honestly, it might. But I also think it's worth paying attention to what we lose as well as what we gain. Because every technological shift creates trade-offs. It gives us new capabilities and sometimes it changes old habits that we didn't realize were important. That's why I do not think the conversation should be about choosing between humans and AI or being for AI versus against it. The technology is here, it's improving, and it's becoming part of how we work whether we like it or not. The real challenge is figuring it out how to use those tools in a way that makes people better, not just faster, because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to produce more reports or answers more emails or finish tasks more quickly. The goal is still the same as it always been, to learn, to grow, to develop judgment, and eventually become the person that others rely on when the answers aren't obvious. And that's why I keep coming back to the same question. If AI starts doing more of the beginner work, how will the next generation become experts? I don't think we know the answer yet, but I do think it's one of the most important questions we'll have to answer over the next decade. Maybe AI will help people learn faster. Maybe it will completely change the way career develop. Maybe we'll look back 10 years from now and realize that many of these concerns never became a problem at all. The truth is, we're still figuring it out. But one thing seems clear. The conversation about AI shouldn't just be about what machines can do. It should also be about how humans continue to learn, grow, and develop expertise in a world where these tools are becoming part of everyday life. And I think that's a conversation worth having. So I'd love to hear from your thoughts. If AI starts doing more of the beginner work, how do you think the future of professionals will gain experience? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these kind of videos about AI, businesses, and the future of work, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.